I never imagined that a routine morning could turn into a nightmare. I stepped outside to find my gate smashed, my private property violated. But it wasn't a thief. It was Karen from the HOA, marching in as if she had the right to inspect my home. The audacity left me frozen. I called the police, expecting them to handle it. But what happened next shocked everyone. How far could one person really go under the guise of authority? And more importantly, what would I do when the rules I thought protected me turned against me? Before the chaos began, life in my neighborhood felt ordinary, almost comforting. I had spent years turning my house into a home, planting a small garden along the fence, repainting the trim a warm, cheerful color, and arranging my backyard so it felt like a private retreat. On weekends, I'd watch the kids ride bikes along the quiet streets, waves of laughter echoing under the warm sun. It was the kind of place where everyone nodded politely, exchanged smiles, and went about their business, until the invisible rules started creeping in. The HOA wasn't much of a presence at first. Occasional newsletters or reminders about landscaping or parking were easy to ignore, mere background noise in an otherwise peaceful life. I never thought the letters, the subtle warnings, or the petty suggestions would escalate into something that felt like an invasion of my own home. There was Karen, of course, the kind of person who seemed harmless at first, always smiling at community events, handing out flyers about neighborhood safety. But over time, I noticed her hovering in ways that didn't feel right. She'd comment on the height of my garden plants, measure the spacing of my driveway cracks, or casually mention how the community standards must be maintained. At the time, I brushed it off as overzealousness. Yet, looking back now, every subtle glance, every seemingly innocent reminder was a warning. The storm was coming, and my peaceful suburban life was about to collide with rules I hadn't agreed to, authority I hadn't asked for, and a neighbor who believed she had the right to police my home. How it started so quietly would soon spiral into a confrontation I never saw coming, and would change my sense of security forever. At first, it was subtle, a note tucked under my door, reminding me that my garden flowers were slightly above HOA approved height. I laughed it off, assuming it was just another overzealous suggestion. But then the letters began to pile up, each more threatening than the last. Fines for unauthorized landscaping, warnings about non-compliant gate structures, even comments about the exact color of my mailbox. Every envelope felt like a punch in the gut, a reminder that my home was no longer mine, that my personal choices were being judged and policed. I tried to reason with the HOA, attending meetings, submitting paperwork, even trimming my flowers down to the exact height they demanded. It should have ended there, right? But that only seemed to fuel Karen's scrutiny. She began showing up unannounced, claiming she needed to inspect my property for compliance. At first, I assumed it was polite oversight, until she started taking pictures, scribbling notes, and lecturing me in front of other neighbors about community standards. My home, my sanctuary, had become a stage for humiliation. Things escalated quickly. One afternoon, I received a certified letter stating I had violated the HOA's obscure gate alignment rule and was being fined hundreds of dollars. The kicker? I hadn't changed my gate in over 5 years. According to Karen, it did not meet current aesthetic requirements. I was stunned. I spent hours researching the HOA bylaws, combing through legal documents that seemed deliberately opaque, every page a reminder of how powerless a single homeowner could feel against a self-appointed enforcer of minor rules. Tension bled into daily life. I couldn't leave my driveway without worrying about being photographed. I avoided gardening because even a small change might be deemed non-compliant. I found myself checking my mailbox anxiously, expecting another fine. Neighbors whispered that Karen had been seen measuring the fences of multiple homes, her clipboard swinging like a badge of authority. I realized I wasn't just a target. I was part of a larger pattern of intimidation, an example for anyone who dared challenge the HOA's whims. Then came the confrontation that changed everything. I was hosting a small backyard gathering when Karen appeared at the fence, uninvited, tapping her pen against a clipboard. She claimed she needed to verify property compliance. I told her firmly that this was private property and she could not enter without consent. Her smile didn't falter, but the way she looked at me made my stomach turn. She was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far she could go before anyone stopped her, and I knew something had to give. Weeks later, I returned home to find my gate damaged. Someone had forced it open. Splintered wood and bent hinges left me breathless. It wasn't a burglary. Nothing was missing. The unmistakable pattern of control was there. My sanctuary had been violated in the most literal sense, and I felt rage, fear, and disbelief all at once. I called the police, who arrived quickly, but even they seemed taken aback by the audacity of an HOA official, or a neighbor acting under the guise of authority, breaking into someone's home. The tension was unbearable. Every day brought new letters, new threats, subtle intimidation from neighbors who had sided with Karen, and the creeping sense that the law was not entirely on my side. I began documenting everything: photographs, videos, recordings of interactions, detailed logs of fines and communications. I knew that if I wanted to protect my home, I couldn't rely on reason alone. I had to be meticulous, relentless, and strategic. And yet, just when I thought I had prepared for the worst, Karen escalated again. This time, she sent a notice claiming I was in violation of property visibility standards, a rule that dictated how far back from the curb my furniture could be arranged. She even suggested I remove a small sculpture I'd placed near the front porch. My sense of reality wavered. How could a sculpture, something that had stood there for years without complaint, suddenly be a legal threat? The absurdity of it made my blood boil, but it also sparked a determination I hadn't felt before. I started reaching out to other homeowners quietly, those who had experienced similar harassment. Stories poured in: neighbors fined for potted plants, cars parked slightly off mark, even holiday decorations deemed inappropriate. A pattern emerged: Karen, armed with the HOA's vague rules, was leveraging fear to control the neighborhood. She thrived on compliance, humiliation, and the illusion of authority. The more I learned, the clearer it became that my struggle was about more than flowers or gates. It was about standing up to an entrenched system that exploited bureaucracy to assert power over ordinary people. The crescendo of anxiety reached a tipping point when I received an email that made my heart stop: a notice of a scheduled property inspection the following day, with a stern warning that failure to comply could result in additional fines. Or worse. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. This wasn't a community check-in, it was a power play designed to intimidate me into submission. And I realized something crucial: I had to confront this head-on, or my home would no longer belong to me. Not in spirit, and perhaps not even in law. As night fell, I sat in my living room, staring at the gate I had built with my own hands, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Karen's persistence, the endless letters, the inspections, the petty fines. It all pointed toward a climax I hadn't yet imagined. I could feel it coming, the moment when the conflict would explode, when my resolve would be tested against authority, absurd rules, and the audacity of someone who believed she could dictate my life. And deep down, I knew that the next day could change everything. The morning of the inspection, I woke with a knot in my stomach so tight it was almost painful. Sunlight spilled across the living room, catching dust motes in the air, but I couldn't see the beauty, I only saw the looming confrontation. Karen was coming, armed with her clipboard, her camera, and a conviction that she had the right to control every detail of my property. Every letter, every fine, every subtle threat had led to this moment. I had prepared as meticulously as I could. The gate was repaired, my garden trimmed to the exact measurements demanded, and every previous notice was documented, bound neatly in a folder labeled by date. I even recorded a hidden camera near the gate, partly out of fear, partly to protect myself. I wasn't naive. I knew that logic alone might not be enough against someone who thrived on intimidation. At precisely 10 a.m., a shadow fell across the driveway. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She immediately began inspecting, snapping pictures, measuring angles, and taking notes in a way that felt almost ritualistic. I watched her calmly, silently documenting everything, feeling a strange combination of rage and resolve building inside me. This time, I wasn't going to retreat. "You know," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "these gates must meet current HOA specifications. And I'm not sure your garden complies either." Her tone suggested she believed she had already won, that the house itself was guilty of some inherent crime. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that every moment of restraint was a move in the battle. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time distorted in that charged air. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, whispering in hushed tones, sensing the drama unfolding but too wary to intervene. I felt the weight of every injustice I'd endured. Every petty fine, every invasive inspection, every moment of humiliation. The tension was unbearable. I realized something crucial. This confrontation wasn't just about a gate, a garden, or a sculpture. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, my home, and my dignity. And then it happened. Karen, growing frustrated with what she considered my lack of compliance, crossed a line. She stepped past the boundary of the gate, her foot touching my property. I froze for a moment, the blood rushing in my ears, before calling out firmly, "You are trespassing. Leave my property immediately." Her smile faltered, but her posture didn't. She glanced at her clipboard, as if the rules on paper somehow gave her more rights than the law itself. I reached for the phone and dialed the police, my hands trembling but my voice steady. When the officers arrived, the entire dynamic shifted. Karen's confident veneer cracked, her authority evaporating in the presence of real law enforcement. She tried to argue, insisting that she had a right to inspect, but the officers calmly informed her that she could not enter private property without explicit permission, documentation, or a court order. Her protests faltered under their scrutiny. As the officers took statements from both sides, a remarkable shift occurred in me. I realized I wasn't just defending a gate or a garden. I was standing against a system that had weaponized bureaucracy, pettiness, and intimidation. Each word I spoke to the officers, each piece of evidence I presented, became an act of reclaiming the life that had been threatened. I watched Karen's confidence erode with each passing minute, her smirk replaced by tension and uncertainty. The situation escalated further when one of the officers asked to see Karen's authorization documents for the inspection. she fumbled, then stammered, finally admitting that there was no official permission granted beyond the general HOA bylaws, which, as the officers pointed out, did not allow her to forcibly enter private property. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every neighbor who had been quietly watching realized what was happening. The enforcer had been exposed as overreaching, perhaps even reckless. Emboldened, I pressed further. I calmly showed the officers my detailed records, photographs of prior violations, copies of letters, and my hidden camera footage capturing her uninvited intrusion. Each document told a story of persistent harassment, of a system abused by a single person wielding rules like a weapon. Karen's face grew pale, her eyes darted nervously. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable, human, and fallible. The police left with a warning to Karen about trespassing, and for the first time, she appeared flustered rather than triumphant. But even in that moment of apparent victory, the tension hadn't fully dissipated. She had proven willing to push boundaries and bend rules, and I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Yet something had shifted. For the first time, I felt the tide turning, a sense of justice breaking through the suffocating tension that had gripped me for months. Then came the final, almost surreal twist. Later that day, the HOA board contacted me. Officially, this time, and not through Karen. They acknowledged that the prior inspections had overstepped boundaries, and that my property was indeed compliant. They offered a formal apology, something I hadn't expected, and promised that fines for the disputed issues would be rescinded. It was almost anticlimactic, yet deeply satisfying. Months of anxiety, fear, and meticulous documentation had culminated in a vindication I had begun to doubt could ever come. Even as the HOA letter arrived, I knew the real triumph was more than paperwork. It was in reclaiming control of my home, in proving that petty tyranny could be resisted, and in standing firm when the rules had been weaponized against me. Karen's power, which had once felt overwhelming, had been exposed as brittle, dependent entirely on the fear she instilled. The most oppressive force in the neighborhood had been disarmed. Not with anger alone, but with preparation, resilience, and the quiet determination to protect what was rightfully mine. As evening fell, I walked through my yard, touching the gate and breathing in the air of reclaimed space. The confrontation, the fines, the letters, the intrusions, they had all led to this moment of clarity. I understood now that rules are meant to serve communities, not to intimidate or control. And I wondered, not without a lingering shiver, how many others had endured similar battles quietly, too afraid to document, to resist, to reclaim what was theirs. I realized the story wasn't entirely over. Karen would return, no doubt, in some form, and the HOA would continue to exist, with all its rules and committees. But I had discovered something far more powerful than fear. The ability to stand firm, to protect my home, and to challenge authority when it oversteps its bounds. The moment had passed, but the lesson remained, like a pulse in my chest, echoing louder than any threat, any fine, any intimidation. And yet, even in that hard-won victory, a question lingered in the back of my mind. How far would someone like Karen go next time? And what would it take to ensure that her version of community standards never threatened another home again? The answer wasn't clear, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. In the days after the confrontation, a strange calm settled over my neighborhood. The gate, once splintered and scarred, had been repaired, and for the first time in months, it swung smoothly on its hinges without the ominous shadow of inspection looming over it. The garden, pruned to the exacting standards that had sparked so much conflict, no longer felt like a battleground. Instead, it became a quiet testament to resilience. Each flower, each blade of grass, stood as a reminder that my home was mine, and that even when confronted by petty authority and intimidation, persistence could reclaim what was rightfully yours. The HOA sent a formal apology the next week. It was sterile, precise, and almost bureaucratic in tone, but it carried weight. They acknowledged that prior inspections had overstepped boundaries, that fines were unjustified, and that procedures had been misused in a way that unfairly targeted me. The letters I had collected for months, every warning, every fine, every veiled threat, suddenly became more than paper. They became evidence that had transformed intimidation into accountability. For the first time, I saw the system not as an unmovable force, but as something that could be challenged and corrected when approached with careful preparation and unwavering resolve. Yet the emotional impact ran deeper than any formal apology could cover. The weeks of harassment, of feeling my personal space violated, had taken a toll on my sense of security and peace of mind. I realized that reclaiming my home wasn't just about defending property. It was about defending my right to live without fear, to make choices without the looming threat of arbitrary judgment. That emotional liberation, the feeling that no one could dictate my life with unchecked authority, was more profound than any material restitution. Neighbors began to approach me with quiet congratulations and shared stories. Many admitted that they, too, had been intimidated by Karen and the HOA's tactics, but had never had the courage to push back. Some had paid fines without protest, believing it easier to comply than to fight. Others had altered their gardens, painted fences a certain color, or removed decorations, all in the name of compliance with vague rules. By standing firm, I had inadvertently sparked a quiet ripple of empowerment. People realized that compliance was optional when it came to unjust enforcement, and that knowledge was contagious. Karen, predictably, withdrew for a time. Her once commanding presence at meetings and inspections dwindled, replaced by murmurs and cautious glances. The veneer of invincibility she had relied upon had been stripped away. It was a small, almost poetic reversal of fortune. The very person who had used fear to assert dominance had been exposed as overreaching, flawed, and vulnerable. But while her personal influence waned, the HOA as an institution remained. A reminder that rules, procedures, and committees could still be misused, and vigilance was necessary to prevent similar abuses in the future. I also noticed changes in myself. The ordeal had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but it had instilled a renewed sense of agency. I began documenting all correspondence, keeping detailed records of interactions, and speaking up in neighborhood meetings. No longer passive, I became a voice advocating for transparency, fairness, and accountability in community governance. It was empowering to realize that I could influence the culture of the neighborhood simply by refusing to accept intimidation as the norm. Legally, the situation remained largely symbolic but significant. While Karen had no criminal charges against her, the police report and documentation of trespassing served as a cautionary precedent. The HOA's acknowledgement of overreach set a boundary that could not easily be ignored in future disputes. I also took the time to educate myself on local property rights and HOA laws, understanding that knowledge was a shield against the kind of petty tyranny that had threatened my peace of mind. There was power in preparation, in knowing one's rights, and in documenting each step meticulously, lessons that would guide me for years to come. Interestingly, the conflict also illuminated the psychology of control and compliance. Karen had relied on fear, uncertainty, and social pressure to enforce her vision of community standards. Her tactics were subtle yet effective: constant scrutiny, public commentary, and minor punishments designed to maintain dominance without overt confrontation. Experiencing her methods firsthand revealed how easily people could be manipulated into compliance when faced with someone willing to weaponize rules for personal authority. It was both infuriating and educational, a case study in petty bureaucracy turned oppressive force. Over time, the community began to shift. Meetings that had once been dominated by Karen's voice now allowed for more open discussion, input from residents, and a focus on reasonable standards rather than arbitrary enforcement. Neighbors, emboldened by the precedent set by my stand, began asking questions, proposing adjustments, and challenging obscure rules that had long gone unexamined. What had begun as a personal struggle transformed into a subtle, collective awakening, a realization that communities are shaped not just by rules, but by the people willing to hold those in power accountable. There were lingering frustrations, of course. Karen occasionally resurfaced, offering advice cloaked in concern or reminders of minor rules. Each time, I met her calmly, with documented evidence and clear boundaries. The power dynamic had shifted. What had once been intimidation now met resistance, and each encounter reinforced the lesson: authority does not equal omnipotence, and persistent, prepared individuals can defend their rights effectively. On a personal level, the ordeal changed how I viewed boundaries and personal space. I became protective not just of my property, but of my emotional well-being. I understood that standing up to arbitrary authority wasn't just a civic duty, it was a form of self-respect. No gate, no fine, no petty rule could ever again dictate my sense of worth or autonomy. The psychological liberation was profound. I had reclaimed not just physical property, but the confidence to assert my rights in the face of intimidation. Friends and family noticed the change, too. Conversations shifted from passive complaints about the HOA to strategic discussions about asserting rights, documenting interactions, and fostering community awareness. I became a resource, sharing insights about how to navigate bureaucratic overreach without escalating conflict unnecessarily. It was rewarding to see others empowered by my experience, transforming what had been a personal battle into a source of communal knowledge and resilience. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the clarity it brought regarding values. The conflict had forced me to weigh patience against assertiveness, compliance against principle, and fear against determination. Each decision, each choice to document, to resist, and to confront Karen's overreach reinforced a personal code: boundaries must be respected, rules must be fair, and intimidation cannot be allowed to dictate behavior. It was a hard-earned lesson, but one that illuminated the broader principle that life, like property, must be defended thoughtfully, decisively, and ethically. Looking back, the situation also revealed the absurdity and fragility of power built on fear. Karen had thrived on compliance, yet her influence evaporated under scrutiny, law, and documentation. The story of her overreach became a cautionary tale within the neighborhood, a reminder that authoritarian tactics, no matter how subtle, are ultimately vulnerable when met with preparation and resilience. It was both a vindication and a warning. A paradoxical mix of satisfaction and vigilance that would linger long after the garden had regrown and the gate had been repaired. Months later, life returned to something resembling normalcy, but I was forever changed. I found myself more attentive to the community, more willing to speak up, and more determined to ensure fairness in ways both subtle and profound. The small victories, the rescinded fines, The official apology, the recognition from neighbors, had cumulative effects, reshaping the culture of the neighborhood one interaction at a time. What had begun as an intensely personal struggle became a catalyst for broader awareness and engagement. Ultimately, the ordeal left me with a lasting takeaway: rules are meant to guide, not to intimidate. Authority is granted, not assumed, and courage, preparation, and persistence can transform even the most absurdly petty conflict into an opportunity for empowerment. Every fine, every note, every inspection had felt like an attack, but in retrospect, each confrontation became a lesson in resilience and strategy, a chance to stand firm against injustice while modeling accountability and composure. And as I sit on my porch now, watching the sunlight spill over the repaired gate and the flourishing garden, I can't help but reflect: how often do we allow fear, intimidation, or petty authority to dictate our choices? How many people quietly comply, sacrificing personal freedom in the name of arbitrary rules? The story of my struggle with Karen and the HOA is, in many ways, a mirror, challenging anyone who hears it to ask themselves what they would do when their boundaries are tested, and whether they would have the courage to reclaim what is theirs. Because in the end, it's not just about gates, gardens, or fines. It's about standing for your rights, protecting your home, and refusing to let fear define your life. It's about understanding that even the most bureaucratic, petty, or overreaching authority can be challenged, and that victory doesn't always come with fireworks or applause, but with the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing you've reclaimed what is yours. And perhaps the most powerful question remains: if you were in my place, would you have the courage to do the same?